Thank you, Erin. So I'm very excited to be having this very necessary conversation about how to expand clean energy and transportation access to underserved communities. It's a topic that's been top of mind recently with all the instances of racial and environmental injustice being brought to light over the past few months, and really should have been top of mind earlier, but I'm glad that it is now. And all of these panelists are working to solve challenges around bringing clean energy and transportation to underserved communities. So please join me in welcoming our panelists today. We have Dana Harmon, the Executive Director of the Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute, TEPRI. Dr. Shelley Francis, the co-founder of EVNoire. It's also her birthday, so everyone wish her a happy birthday in the comments. And Amy Atchley, the Senior Project Lead of Electric Vehicles and Emerging Technology at Autin Energy. So thank you all for being here today, for joining us for ETS20, even though it had to be virtual. And so a lot of today's conversation is really going to center around this idea of energy burden that lower income communities face. So Dana, I'll start with you, and could you just start us out by defining what energy burden actually means?
Sure, I'll be happy to, and thank you, Erin, very much for having me back to ETS. So many people are familiar with the concept of housing cost burden, or the notion that no more than 30% of household income should go towards housing, and anything over that is considered unaffordable. Well, a similar framework can be applied to residential energy costs. And a fairly commonly accepted threshold is that anything over 6% of household income is considered unaffordable for energy. A recent study conducted by our researchers here at TEPRI showed that in Texas, low-income households had an average energy burden of 10% compared to just 2% for non-low-income households. So a much larger share of the wallet is spent on energy. We believe that related to this panel discussion, distributed energy resources really do have the opportunity, or present us with the opportunity, to provide not just financial benefits, but environmental and social benefits to underserved communities, including the 3.8 million low to moderate income households in Texas who are normally less likely to participate in solutions like energy efficiency, rooftop solar, and other distributed energy resources for a whole host of reasons, including lack of access to capital and lower credit scores and lower rates of home ownership.
Great, thank you. And Amy, I know this has been a focus at Autin Energy. Can you talk a little bit about the role that the utility can play in expanding access to DERs and electric vehicles to these communities?
Yes, thank you, Erin. And really, it comes down from the utility standpoint to addressing and assessing the energy and environmental justice needs of underserved communities. We are looking at, kind of 3 tiers: reducing the energy burden, increased equity, and this is around siting of infrastructure, ensuring that we are putting the infrastructure where it's accessible to our low-income communities and communities of color, so that we can accelerate adoption and bring in people who've typically left out of emerging technologies. We also are looking at expanded economic development, which is providing jobs, and it's providing growing wealth in these communities that have been left behind or falling behind financially. And the way that we do this is through a couple of ways. And the first, I'll speak to this really fun screen in just a second, but the first really starts foundationally with creating human-centered design programs. And this is where we are engaging the community. We're taking feedback so that we're creating real solutions for real people. We're going in and getting that information to influence the design of our programs. We're also working collaboratively. Collaboration is the key in all of this. We're working with the community members and the residents by taking surveys and focus groups. We're getting out at community events and neighborhoods. We're also working with community-based organizations like nonprofits. They've got boots on the ground. They can really help guide us as we are designing these programs. Education and outreach is huge. It's a huge utility piece that we can bring in our sphere of influence. And so, as you see on the screen here, one of the programs that we put together that we launched in November 2018 is called EVs for Schools. It's a program that provides EV charging combined with EV curriculum at public schools. The schools that were selected to be recipients of the program were all targeted for economically disadvantaged students. It also includes an outreach component that's ongoing. We know that these students in these communities are not going to have the access to these wonderful technologies and resources. So we want to make sure that we're kind of spreading that out and reaching those kids. And we're doing it in a way that creates an educational living lab. These students are seeing their heroes, the teachers plugging in their EVs, and then they're getting the curriculum and it becomes a part of their culture. So it's really, from the utility standpoint, it's about shifting behaviors and mindsets and building trust in the community.
Great, thank you. I love that you that you talk about starting with young people. I know that a lot of them are really just interested in electric vehicles. They just think they're cool. They know what Teslas are, and they just are already thinking they're cool. So starting with that younger generation, I think is really great. But it's not just financial burden that these communities face, but there are proven health implications. And Shelley, I actually read a piece that you just published in the Baltimore Sun that everybody else should read as well, talking about some of these issues. So can you maybe talk about how access to clean energy and electric vehicles affects these communities from a public health perspective?
Sure, absolutely. So what we know is that the number one cause of carbon emissions is transportation, which adversely impacts Black, African American, Latinx, and tribal communities, and that's devoid of socioeconomic status or education. And so as someone who is studying health disparities and the social determinants of health, we know that the biggest predictor of health outcomes is zip code and race. Our organization has been doing a lot of research exploring the intersection of transportation, pollution, and looking at what's happening with how the pandemic is playing out. And so when you look at these trends, you see that COVID has really shined a magnifying glass on the inequities that have existed. And what we see is that Black, Latinx, and tribal communities are being disproportionately impacted in terms of mortality as well as morbidity. And so newer technologies like electric vehicles really have an opportunity to dramatically reduce the dangers of local air pollution, as well as lead to healthier lives for individuals in frontline communities. And when we say frontline communities, those are the communities that are living near transportation corridors, by refineries, near ports, and they typically skew Black, Latinx, and tribal communities.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. And Amy, back to you. When we're talking about access to EVs, it's not necessarily just cars, but transportation in general. Public transportation, microtransit. Can you talk a little bit about what Austin Energy is doing in these areas?
Yeah, transportation in Austin is the #2 household expense. And that really is mirrored across the country. There was a recent study at Harvard University on upward mobility, and it states that access to reliable transportation can lift people from poverty. So that we understand that we need to bring alternative mobility. We need to bring different options to people to provide independence, to just provide those options for the daily transportation needs for, enhancing the quality of life and, doing things like providing ladders of opportunity. One of the things that we've done at Austin Energy is this slide that you see here. We've conducted hundreds of e-bike demos, and this particular photo here, this is one of our events where we did 103 e-bike demos in one day, and that is an event where we're targeting our low-income customers and just getting to experience that with them, watching them have their first go at an e-bike is so exciting. And for the first time, they may have just realized there may be a problem that can be solved if they had access to an electric bike. This is Austin resident Maria, and she's a single mom of two. And we got her on the e-bike. She put the kids in the back cargo, as you can see. And most people just took a couple of spins around, but she just kept going around and around and around. And she had this amazing smile that you can see on her face. And she said, I can take my kids to school and then I can get to the store. And it just sounds kind of like a simple thing, but it's actually something that can be life-changing. So we need to look at how are we marketing our electric vehicles and our used vehicles. Austin Energy, we have a new site called ev.austinenergy.com. If you look at that website, you will be able to browse inventory on electric vehicles available to you today. We're about to launch our 2.0 version that's going to be a focus on used vehicles, so we can help promote how to find that EV and then supplement it with e-mobility like electric bikes or our bus system, which you'll see on the next slide there. We're working with Cap Metro, which is our public transit. And we had this amazing event. We've launched electric buses here in Austin. We already have some on the street. We launched the first two, and we've got, the reason why the kids are in the picture is because they provided the artwork, as you can see in the back, and it's just beautiful. And it involves a community, so they feel like there's a sense of ownership in this with us. The electric buses are on the road. 2019, Cap Metro announced that all buses purchased in the future would be electric, and they're going to be able to do that exclusively beginning in 2022. There's already 2 on the road and 12 or 10 more to be released in 2020, and then they will continue rolling out. And Austin Energy's role in that, big role, is supporting the charging. So we've got a depot that we've put together that we will be able to support charging at one time 187 electric buses. So it's really pushing the city to lead by example in electric mobility. And we're talking about EVs, electric buses, shared mobility, e-mobility. So there's lots of options, and we just want to make sure that we're bringing everyone along in the community, especially those who really need the options the most.
Yeah, we've heard a lot about fleet electrification over the past week, and I'm really glad to see that City of Austin is moving in that direction too. So Dana and Shelley, I know you both focus heavily on research and looking at data and then using that data for best practices. So I'm wondering, and Dana, I'll start with you, but how can researchers partner with other stakeholders like utilities, cities, even banks and other community organizations to provide a roadmap for solving challenges around energy equity?
Thanks, Erin. It's a great question. And, we're at a time that we have access to unprecedented amount of data, right? And we have, emerging technologies and tools available. And I think there's this growing attention to really understand how to leverage that data and those analytical capabilities to meet the needs of our most vulnerable community members. And we've just got to be smart about how we do it. And I think, comprehensive discussions and approaches like this one, where we are examining our vulnerable neighbors and their relationships with energy and how that affects health, how it affects housing, how it affects transportation, I think is a really important discussion for us to be having. At TEPRI, we often focus or think about the kind of the continuum of energy engagement and energy management. In many cases, really starting with utility bill assistance programs, often in crisis mitigation mode to make sure that people can keep the lights on and and stay comfortable in their homes. And then moving to basic energy efficiency work, building envelope improvements, weatherization, and really looking for building optimization techniques that may be most appropriate. And then kind of moving along the continuum, looking at opportunities in the right applications for this suite of more advanced energy technologies, from rooftop solar to community solar to access to demand response programs, and this vehicle electrification conversation, I think all have a really important part to play in this discussion. And we need to make sure that the benefits of each of those technologies are available to the full population and deployed in a way that is very closely tied with the needs of the community, as Erin was mentioning. And I think we're really better positioned than ever before to provide services that are tailored very specifically to address the needs of low to moderate income households, with the engagement strategies that Amy was mentioning. I also think an important part of this is, that none of us has the benefit of the perspective of all of us, right? And so whether we're with the utilities or a technology provider or researchers or policymakers or NGOs, we all work in different parts of this ecosystem. And that means we all hold parts of different potential solutions. And so I think it's conversations like this one that we're having now and that you all are hosting at ETS that help kind of build that ecosystem and allow us to really leverage the research and the data and the learnings that we're finding together to enable effective and evidence-based change in our communities.
Great, thank you. And Shelley, what are your thoughts?
Yes, sure. I'll jump right in here. So I think that's a great question. So our approach in how we address this particular issue is really utilizing best practices and using a data-driven approach. And so it's really important to understand and recognize that there's knowledge in communities, and it's critical that when you consider these factors, that when you approach these constructs as partners, you really have to consider these things. We also know from our work that the message and the messenger are gravely important. So our membership organization, which is EVNoire, which is the nation's largest network of diverse EV drivers and enthusiasts with members and chapters around the country, we leverage this membership organization to accelerate and advance EV adoption. So this organization really provides a great entry point for partners that want to engage with more diverse communities and more partners and drivers, but keep it in mind that trust is really gravely important to this conversation. And so I think some of the takeaways would be that, one, you have to partner with communities, but you also need to partner with subject matter experts in e-mobility best practices. And you should also really be intentional in using a data-driven approach and build trust with those partners. It's extremely critical.
Yeah, great points. I mentioned this earlier on another panel, but trust is a recurring theme that we've been hearing throughout ETS, and whether it's within an organization, from the top down, building trust, or whether it's between a utility or other organizations building trust within their community. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that. And on that note, you all have been doing lots of work to solve these challenges. And so I'd love to just hear about some specific projects or case studies that you could talk about. And so Dana, maybe you could start.
Sure. Well, I'll talk about some of our recent work, really focused a bit more on the distributed energy resources side, but I think it ties in well with the discussion that we're having today. We recently conducted a project focused on Harris County, which is the county of Houston, Texas, really looking for to identify opportunities for distributed energy resources to reduce energy burdens in Houston. And we wanted to make sure that we were looking for opportunities for the benefits of DERs to flow to the communities that needed them most. Our analysis, we did an evaluation of the energy affordability gap experienced by low-income residents in Houston, meaning how much more are they paying for energy than people can afford. And then we looked at the residential building stock, both single family and multifamily, and did an evaluation of the energy efficiency potential of those buildings, meaning if we invested in energy efficiency, how much could reduce the energy cost burden for residents. And then also looked at rooftop solar. And the potential for rooftop solar on those buildings to reduce energy cost burdens. And this was also in conjunction with the city of Houston recently released its climate action plan and looking at how decarbonization objectives may be, how those investments may help with those objectives. And in summary, the study really showed that the energy affordability gap can be economically eliminated with targeted energy efficiency improvements in residential buildings in that community. And we thought this was really promising because I think what it means is that if we do deploy our investments strategically with the intent of reducing energy cost burdens as well as the decarbonization and energy savings goals, we can achieve some of those layered benefits that we were discussing earlier in the panel. Our rooftop solar evaluation in that same study showed that the rooftop solar does have the technical potential to eliminate the energy affordability gap, but economically we're not quite there yet in that specific scenario, and that energy efficiency is probably still the better investment in large part. But we think that studies like this one are applicable and useful for each of the technologies that we're discussing, and for other communities as well. And I think, a similar analysis looking at the potential for electric vehicles and the transportation evaluation could be quite helpful. And that's the type of work that we're doing now that we think has a lot of potential to increase deployment of EVs and DERs in those communities.
Great, thank you for sharing. Amy, can you share some projects from Autin Energy?
Sure. Seems like we've got a lot of plates spinning, but I'd like to sort of feature a little bit about affordable housing because it's just really intertwined. We've got over 40% of Austin's population living in affordable housing. If you want to drive an EV, it's most ideal to plug into that outlet, that regular wall outlet in your garage. So a lot of people don't have that garage. So what does that mean? It means we need to expand charging at multifamily. And so Autin Energy has had a focus on this for quite some time. We've deployed in partnership with complexes to add this charging, including in affordable housing. We've got several with foundation communities. They really want to expand their entire profile. And so we help them with that, and we help them identify funding, and we also support them with our rebate programs. In addition, kind of taking it to the next step, as we were talking a little bit about micromobility, we have a new project that we've been working on. I'm very excited about. It's a public-private partnership with Autin Energy, with our bike share, Austin B-Cycle, as well as with Cap Metro to serve HACA residents. HACA residents is the housing authority of the city of Austin. These are our neighbors here that live in the most poverty complexes that we have in Austin. It's pretty much like annual income, $14,000 per household or less. So we know that this group of people could really use some help with access to transportation. So what we're doing is we're working to provide e-bike training specifically around bike share. We're going to launch before the end of the year with a virtual training, and then we're going to provide, when it's safe to gather again in person, training where we'll take people on safety routes, adventure tours to the HEB, to the grocery store, to the Social Security office, just also encouraging people to learn about safe routes to our bus transit system for first mile, last mile solution. We will include a digital inclusion piece for digital literacy, so people will understand how to load that up to their smartphone. And if they don't have a smartphone, we're going to have fobs created so they will still have access to unlock those bikes. There's a low-income program that's offered through this, and actually those that are going to participate in this initial training will receive a free year on our bike share, so we can really encourage that uptick and uptake in this technology. So we had COVID come in and sort of get in the way of our training. We're supposed to be done with it already, but we are launching some awesome interactive videos before December. And then hopefully in late spring, early summer, we'll be on bikes with our neighbors in Haka.
Great, I'll definitely follow along on the progress there. And Shelley?
Sure. So our consulting group, EVNoire, has been working across the country and we've been leading the conversation in e-mobility best practices and equity best practices. Just last week, we collaborated with the Congressional Black Caucus to facilitate a panel as part of the legislative annual conference, which focused on addressing electric vehicles in Black and Latinx communities and how we can accelerate adoption. We've also facilitated the second largest electric vehicle event in the country. We have a number of pilots that are running across the country to accelerate adoption, as well as increase adoption of multimodal EV and clean transportation approaches. And through our work, we found that there are definitely some knowledge gaps. So whether it's with utilities, municipalities, or communities in the space, there's issues and more education that needs to be facilitated. So one of the events that we're facilitating to try to address that is that we're curating the National E-Mobility Equity Conference in November, so November 12th and 13th, and we're aiming to really help address some of those gaps that we see in the space and share e-mobility best practices, as well as discuss equity best practices from programs and thought leaders from around the country. So I would certainly encourage participants to go to our site and learn more information about it, and they can register there. I'll drop that in the chat shortly.
Great, thank you. And I have one more question for you all. I did want to let our audience know that if they have any questions, they can post them in the chat in the platform there. But this is a question I asked my panel earlier today, which coincidentally was also an all-women panel. But it's a question that we ask a lot of people at Zpryme. It's just interesting to hear from people. So the question is, did you find energy or did energy find you? Meaning, did you know from a young age that you wanted to be in this industry, or did you just sort of fall into it? Shelley, we'll start with you.
You put me on the hot seat immediately. So I would say I found it because of my background in public health and health disparities and social determinants of health. Looking at environmental factors and the built environment is a natural part of this conversation around clean transportation and air pollution. So I would say because of my passion and the different work that I've done in this space and working with communities, that really is a real nice mesh or intersection for me to be able to do three things that I really love.
That's awesome, great. And Dana?
What an interesting question and kind of fun to think about. I think I'd have to say that energy found me, and I'm really thankful that it did. I came into the energy space about 10 years ago now, after kind of an early stint in my career in management consulting, which I'm really thankful for in retrospect, because I think it gave me sort of some of this systems level thinking that's really helpful for working in the space. And I think energy as a sector is really fascinating in terms of the benefits that it brings to society generally, in both in terms of poverty alleviation, economic development, in terms of just our ability to be comfortable in quality of life. But then I think what has kind of kept me here and kept me fascinated by this discussion is how do we make sure that both the cost and the benefits of energy are distributed equitably, in a way that allows everyone to participate. And I think that's not really just cost in terms of financial costs, like the energy cost burden discussion we're having. But as Shelley mentioned, I think so much of this conversation does have to do with public health. It does have to do with housing. I think there's a really important, workforce development conversation here and participation in the clean energy economy. And so, I think, and all of this at a time when this, this sector is so incredibly dynamic, as we're going through this energy transition and decarbonization. And what does that mean? And what does it look like? And how can we do so, focus on this, massive movement in a way that allows equitable access for everybody, and everybody gets to participate, and it makes our communities, healthier and live productive and thriving lifestyles. And the other thing that I just wanted to mention on this is, I think another, there are conversations like this that are so inspiring for me and Amy and Shelley and Erin, all the work that you all are doing. It's so cool to learn about what you're focused on, and I feel that that's a huge privilege. And I think the other thing that's wonderful about this is the idea of, us being able to bring up energy leaders of the future. And, there's a lot of work to do in this space, and we need, as many good, diverse thought leaders in doing this work as we can get. And so I think it's really a privilege to be able to think that we're investing in the future of energy in our communities in that way. Sorry, that was a little bit of a long answer to a short question, but
many great points that you just made. Thank you for that. And Amy, what about you?
Yeah, I likewise echo what you said, Dana. It is a privilege to be at the table today with these fabulous women, talking about cutting edge leading in this industry. And gosh, do you all remember the book, Oh, the Places You'll Go? Dr. Seuss. So technology and energy was never in my tract. I don't know how I ended up here, other than I started out in my professional career in social services. I worked initially for MTV Networks at VH1 Save the Music Foundation, restoring music educations across the country for youth at risk. And then back here in Texas, I started working as part of the senior management team at Meals on Wheels Central Texas, helping people in poverty, our seniors who really don't have a voice. So I did that for quite some time, working on about 20 years now. Carl Popham came to me with a grant funded opportunity and asked me to apply for a job, and it was funded by 11th Hour Project, which is an organization part of the Schmidt Family Foundation. They promote social and environmental justice. And they said, we like what you're doing in Austin, Carl, let's give you a program to develop for low-income communities. So we really didn't know where to go. Carl asked me, what did I think? And I said, I'm ready to do something totally different. So I jumped in, took a leap of faith, so to speak, and it's been just incredible. And I'll tell you, I get to be around all these very educated people with their engineering degrees and such. So I've been learning as if I've been in my getting my master's degree program here as learning in the past 3.5 years on energy and technology. And wow, what a time to be in energy. And I think you said it well, Dana, this is the time where energy can really benefit people. It probably always was the time, but it is an essential need. And all of these emerging technologies need to be available to everyone in order to lift us all up. If we lift up only one section of the community, then we're all behind. So I would just say, I came to technology, and it's just been exciting for me to be able to help my community in this way. And it's a privilege and an honor to do it.
Yeah, I love hearing about how different everyone's background is, but sort of ended up, at least today, in the same place. So Erin Hardick has actually put a poll in the platform. So for people who are watching, if you want to participate in our Did You Find Energy or Did an Energy Find You poll, you can click on the poll tab. There is one question for Shelley. Do you have any insight into how many Black, Latinx, and POC own EVs? What do you see as the biggest barriers for those specific communities to adopt electric vehicles?
So I don't have the specific number, and that's a great question. But the specific barriers that we're seeing from the work that we're doing, right now we're facilitating focus groups in several markets around the country. And a consistent theme is around awareness and education. Some of the barriers include the living charging deserts. And so when we were talking about utilities earlier, that's one of the ways that utilities can actually provide additional support is by helping to address charging infrastructure and deployment and making sure that it's deployed in an equitable manner. An example of this was that recently at the end of August, Southern California Edison had approved about $436 million to build out 38,000 chargers in the Southern California territory, and with a special emphasis on low to moderate income communities. And so we need more impactful programs and deployment such as that. That's a way to help address issue, but before you put metal in the ground, you really have to make sure that you're intentionally marketing. And one of the ways that you can do that is by making sure you have the right messengers. And so we use our membership organization to really do some of that grassroots level engagement and showing communities that there are people that are reflective of themselves in these vehicles and utilizing this technology. And then even taking it one step beyond that is that we don't want people to just be consumers, but we also want to show them the entrepreneurial opportunities, the economic and workforce development opportunities that are available in that clean transportation / EV ecosystem.
Great, thank you. Does anyone have closing thoughts? We have about 2 minutes left.
So I will say that we're really at a tipping point or like a pivotal moment in time with the, dealing with COVID and what happens beyond COVID, and looking at what just happened a couple hours ago with Governor Newsom signing the executive order stating that by 2035, California is not going to be able to sell any fossil fuel vehicles. So we're really we have an opportunity to do things very differently than we did before COVID. And for us, in the work that we're doing, we're going to continue to facilitate best practices, as well as making sure that we're widening the tent to make sure that more communities are engaged in the conversation around accelerating EV adoption.
Great, thank you. Dana,
sorry, just one closing thought as I'm reflecting back on this conversation that we're having together, and I think that there's part of the question that we're all sort of discussing is really how do we affect change, right? Shelley, to your point of how do we position ourselves so that after COVID is better in many ways than before COVID, and I do think that some of it goes back to Erin, your question earlier about how do we use the research and what we're learning and the great work that Amy was just describing that Autin Energy is doing and what they're learning. How can we make sure to create those kind of virtuous cycles and feedback loops so that we're engaging with the community, we're learning from community members, we're sharing what we're learning, we're collecting the data and doing the research so that we can inform other stakeholders of what's working and what's best practices, so that we can deploy more equitable clean energy solutions. And so I think there's this really kind of important theory of change, so to speak, where we're listening, we're learning, we're testing, we're deploying, and we're working collectively in this ecosystem so that we can create more equitable energy solutions for everybody, for our entire community.
Well said. I think that's the perfect way to close out this panel. Thank you, Dana, Amy, and Shelley. I've really enjoyed the conversation today. If we'll share your information with our audience if people have other questions for you. And with that, I'll invite Erin Hardig back to close things out for the day. Thank you, everyone.